Welcome back to CDW's Tech Talks podcast. If you joined us last week, you'll know we're right in the middle of a great conversation with Jodey Hogeland from Dell Technologies. We're going to dive right back into that. And if you did not catch part one, feel free to go back and look at that. Thanks again. And here's the podcast. So another way that things have been changing is when we think of getting away from like a cloud first reality and really looking more at a cloud optimized reality where we're looking at our on-premises solutions. We're seeing a lot of innovation at the edge. So you've observed organizations moving away from more of a strict cloud first mandate. We've started to see, hybrid infrastructure and leveraging the benefits of the on-premises infrastructure, the benefits of the cloud infrastructure, more where needed. In your experience, what are some of the specific triggers, cost, latency, sovereignty that are bringing some of those workloads maybe back on premises, or when new applications are being developed, they're really being developed for in the data center, in the co-location, or at the edge?
Yeah, I'll never forget. About 10 years ago, I was part of an executive briefing at a major hypervisor entity at the time, and so we had a joint customer we were having a conversation with, and the customer said, we're cloud first, we're cloud first, we're cloud first, we're cloud first. And that became, very prevalent in other customer conversations about a decade ago, where everybody was cloud first. And the reality was it was a particular hyperscaler that was very prominent at saying, "Hey, we're not only are we cloud first, but we're in this hyperscaler environment." Fast forward a decade now, and it's not necessarily a cloud first conversation. It's a right cloud, right place conversation. So it's AWS, it's Azure, it's Google Cloud, it's Oracle Cloud, it's all of these different providers that businesses are doing. That they have environments, applications, data sets that they're using, querying, and all of those different hyperscalers. Shift that to on-prem, and so what we've seen over the past decade is this, cloud first, cloud first, cloud first has shifted to cloud right. Or what's the right workload for this? And then there are, to your point, there are certain aspects of data that customers have found out, sometimes through trial and error, maybe putting something in a public environment. They realize through compliance or regulatory, laws that get put in place that data can't be there. It has to be in an on-prem ecosystem. And so they're working to get, that back, some of that repatriation effort that we see. But I do see customers globally today, they are making very strategic decisions about data placement. And that data placement is often predicated on, security and compliance and regulatory and governance. Like that's kind of the number one driver for, all right, what's going to dictate that this is an on-prem ecosystem. There are some cases where customers will look at availability metrics and say, hey, for this workload, it has to be in our on-prem ecosystem because we want to maintain the integrity of the business continuity and disaster recovery. We can't be across geographical availability zones for certain reasons. So they'll make decisions based on that. But I do see a much more blended environment. I think it's anytime something shifts, right, sometimes the pendulum swings too far one way or the other. And the truth is somewhere in the middle, right? it eventually kind of comes back. And so I think one thing that is interesting in that to me as well is, a decade ago, cloud first, and it was kind of a single hyperscaler conversation. Now it's also, this blend on-prem, but it's not just a singular hypervisor anymore either. We've got customers, that are, hey, we're Broadcom. We've got these container environments that are growing rapidly. We were talking about a moment ago, and they're like, hey, we need OpenShift virtualization, and we need to be using OpenShift for these container deployment methodologies. You've got customers that are using specific environments that they want inside of Nutanix, ecosystems. You got customers that are really spinning up. I mean, they're really getting forward thinking and saying, you know what, we can do this with, things like, open capabilities with, Proxmox, for example. So, I mean, customers are getting very creative And that on-prem ecosystem is getting very diversified, just like we've seen cloud get very diversified. We're seeing that, in on-prem infrastructure as well.
Yeah, and I don't want to spoil it too much, but I think we're going to start at some point. We start talk about what are some of the things that we can do to mitigate. We'll start talking about platforms and stuff like that because I think you're right. When I look at the shift in, especially around hypervisor in that, I talk to customers about it. It's a compelling event, and you may decide to continue doing the same thing that you've been doing, but you do need to make a decision, and it sort of creates this decision point. I think you're right to call out containers. I think that there's there's an opportunity for organizations to maybe reevaluate, what are the pros and cons of containers? How could we potentially leverage, be more aggressive with our container strategy? So yeah, I think that's a great call out.
Yeah, I think in the storage world in particular, the container integration piece is very interesting because I was on an executive leadership call a couple of days ago, and as we were having conversations, one of the senior, an SVP asked me, like, what do you see in, is this only the big players in the world, the largest of the large, the Fortune 500 companies, et cetera? And I'm like, no, like, I was in Houston this past week. I met with an oil and gas company, and they have a lone single Linux administrator,
Mhm.
and he said, I've been tasked with, figuring out, what are we going to do and how are we going to deploy containers. This wasn't a are we going to deploy? It was how are we going to deploy? And so they're recognizing that some of these, upcoming next gen application capabilities are really, kind of built into the framework of how containers operates, and it's shifting away from some of the traditional virtualization models into the container model. And I think to your point, that doesn't mean that the one way is going away. I think it's going to be a very blended conversation. And from a Dell lens, our capability with container integration with container storage modules, leveraging CSI, it's the same thing across our entire portfolio, and it comes included with the solutions. So that's a critical piece of that. And then what we're doing with Dell Automation Platform, particularly Dell Private Cloud, and saying, hey, a customer, at the click of a button, can simplify this deployment because a lot of them don't have the resources to just dedicate themselves to container-based ecosystems. They're having to do a lot of different things. So, when we can say, hey, yeah, you need to go in that direction, you want to go in that direction, and here's why, but we can give you the easy button to click, automate that deployment.
Yeah, and that was always my experience in IT is we had the demand from the business, but not the resources. So
Yeah, exactly. And that's only gotten to be a bigger challenge, as we've moved into the future. Those things have gotten more and more strict. You've got, less people having to do more things, and that's
mhm.
a real challenge.
Yeah, and I think that also touches on another topic, which is really at the same time that the complexity and some of the rigor and the governance and everything is falling on the shoulders of IT and at least their traditional infrastructure team now has I would say more the support of their cybersecurity and governance teams where maybe they were at odds. I think I've started to see those teams come closer together because they realize they need each other. Because the other thing we're seeing is um, at least at a entry level perspective, shadow IT and the ability of business stakeholders to spin up their own IT environments has become much easier. so
Yeah.
so what I mean when you think about how is that sort of shadow IT and maybe some of these business enablement tools where the business is now able to deploy more complex IT systems without sometimes the governance. But how is that creating unexpected pressure on infrastructure teams that you work with and some of the infrastructure leaders that you talk to?
I give you a I'll give you two quick examples. Number one, I met with a very large $60 billion global entity. I was meeting with their CTO, and he said, that their HR team had come in to him. HR leaders came to him and said, "Hey, we're going to test out this new HR application." He said, "Great. Hey, we have these free credits and this particular hyperscaler. All right, great. So we'll spin up that environment out there. You test it out if you like it. We have our own on-prem infrastructure where our HR application is already running and deployed. So you test it, you like it, let us know. We deploy, we go, run, good to go. All right. So, fast forward, 6 months, the CTO gets a bill from the hyperscaler for $180,000. And he's like, what is that? And so had his team chase that down. They came back and they said, there's this application that's running out there. It's an HR application. He said, what? So he calls the HR leader in the company and says, hey, what's going on? Like, why are we getting this bill? And they said, oh, well, we did the testing. It all worked. And so it was all running, working, validated. So we started using it and started migrating our on-prem, $60 billion global company. So the HR system is rather large, right? And so they started migrating, into that environment. He's like, no, he's like, we have to, like, we have infrastructure for that. And so, so then they spun up the infrastructure, and then they couldn't break because they already started this migration process, where they were taking on-prem, moving it into the cloud, but now they were having to take it out of the cloud and bring it right back on-prem. And so what should have been a free test in that type of ecosystem, and by the way, they made that decision because it was going to be easy to rapidly stand up and provision that environment in the cloud to do the test. Right. But now this free test wound up costing them about $1.2 million in 18 months of time. Right. And so, customers are looking for, okay, well, how do I model that easy button, that simplicity of the hyperscaler capability? But I need to be able to do that on-prem. Right. And so that way I can make it as if it's going in the cloud, it's going in the cloud. If it's the right use case, it's the right use case. But in this case, it should have been on-prem, but they simply made that decision because it was easier to rapidly deploy and provision that in the cloud to do the test. So, bringing that type of capability, on-prem is a big piece of the strategy. Another piece, that's interesting is, I told you, I met with these 23 executives in 3 different cities in Asia. 50% of those at the table were CISOs, were security officers. And, so the security of the CISO is playing a much more prominent role now, in environments because, and their words to me were, they didn't say they were terrified, but they were pretty much saying they were terrified, right? They like whether it's network, whether it's core applications, whether it's physical infrastructure, everybody's trying to figure out the security and compliance and regulatory, environments. And then you've got different companies, and coming out of Europe, you've got frameworks like NIS2 and DORA, they're putting very specific standards. In India, they have something called DPDP, which is kind of the equivalent of NIS2 and DORA frameworks, where basically we're moving into an era where these large companies, if there was a security compromise or, compliance data was compromised in some way, they get slapped by a regulatory body within the government entity of that country, and they'd say, hey, you're going to get charged this multi-million-dollar fine. And they go, okay, we're sorry. Here's our multi-million-dollar payment. Now, the executives are being held accountable, like personally. Like, if you are not taking these very basic standards and putting them into practice, everything's encrypted at rest, for example. Everything has to meet basic security qualifications. We're not talking about insane standards, but we're talking about basic measures. If you're not taking those basic measures, they're not just coming to your company and saying, hey, it's a $10 million fine. They're coming to your company and saying, hey, we're taking your house away and you're going to jail, right? It's a much different world. And seeing, how on-prem ecosystems, the security of those ecosystems, the security officers are bridging those, like you said, used to be these disparate entities within IT organizations, are all rapidly coming together to meet and exceed basic security standards.
Yeah, I feel like there's more of a sense that we're all in the same boat together, which is great because I think the infrastructure teams need that. But you're right. I've had more conversations in the last 18 months with security executives around data resiliency and network resiliency, and now API security. Because to your point, like that's how things have evolved, and it's really grown the stakeholders responsible. So
Let me
pivoting
give
to
you that it reminds me on, one very, you talked about shadow IT, particularly if we look at that through the lens of AI. I was on site with a customer and I was brought in to talk storage specifically. But while we were sitting there at the table, the Dell rep asked, the IT executive, a CIO, said, "Hey, how is that AI server working out?" And he's like, "What AI server?" And he looks at his team, and the team is like, they're confused. They're like, "What are you talking about?" And he's like, "Y'all, we received an order for this AI server. Just wanted to see how that was going." And like nobody in this room even knew what they were talking about. And so the whole meeting got derailed, like because they were trying to figure out what was this AI server that came into their environment. Well, turns out it was an application owner that made this decision because they were being sold this particular package from a software vendor to run this university environment. And they said, "Oh, by the way, if you want to unlock these AI modules, you need this type of infrastructure." So the application owner made this requisition of an AI server, and the IT infrastructure team didn't even know that had happened. And this thing was, it had not been brought in and put into production yet because they would have obviously have seen that, but it was sitting on the loading dock, and they didn't even know that was happening. So, that whole shadow IT thing is still a real problem. And how it you, bringing IT people together where used to be network didn't talk to storage and storage didn't talk to compute, and you had all these little silos. That's all kind of getting remedied. But I think the next front of that is how do you start bridging, the application owners, the developers writing API integration to certain things. How do all of those, sheep get brought into the fold, as far as being on the same page from a security strategy perspective?
Yeah, and the interesting thing there is it having worked in mining, we always had operational technology systems, and that's still one of the biggest challenges, whether you're in manufacturing, whether you're in oil and gas, whether you're in energy production, mining, um, where those systems are generally, operated, managed, a lot of times architected, outside of the core IT teams, and there really is a need to better, collaborate. But with these new AI systems, I can see that's the gap between it being a shadow IT project and it being a legitimate IT project that's being done by the business is so small.
Yeah.
So one of the other things that we're seeing is you know we used to sort of sit on data because we needed it for compliancy, and I think one of the greatest backup projects we ever did at Barrick was we put in a really good data retention policy, and we deleted a ton of backlogged data that just needed to be deleted. Where where now, again, we sort of mentioned that there's sort of this, in some cases, unknown value in some of this data. I think you brought up a really good point around sometimes just a little bit of bad data isn't just having the wrong data in your data set. It can actually poison other good data sets that are, and reference points that are in there. But as we're seeing these AI models develop, there's a need in a lot of cases to re-ingest or rehydrate some of this data. And then we're also seeing a demand in real time to take the latest available data and make that available for some of these processes. Because especially if you're in a real-time business like, stock trading and analysts or something like that, where you want the latest because you're really trying to drive that moment to moment value. What are you seeing from like re-ingestion and real timeness of data that's needed?
It's you're 100% correct on the driving force of that is recognizing the need to close the gap towards real-time decision making and real-time data. So if you're trying to make a market-based decision, whether that's, the financial markets, whether that's the oil and gas market, even in healthcare, if you're trying to make a patient, decision, you don't want to be making a patient decision off, data or imaging that's, days old, weeks old, months old. You need what is the most current, piece of information, what's the most current piece of data, what's the most current, test result, that I can look at. So, finding ways within your infrastructure to take the most current data and have that be given access to your AI models of some sort is becoming a bigger piece of the ecosystem. And we're seeing that, both with technology companies and internal development, with customers, doing their own internal development, building, connectors, into the AI infrastructure. using, protocols, AI-based protocols that are, being used to connect to these environments, and therefore building agents, and so the agentic framework that's happening, that is the fastest growing piece that I see right now. I think everybody's kind of figured out, what the learning models need to look like, the using this version, but they kind of got that piece of it frameworked and figured out. Now it's the growing agentic framework and the agentic agents, and saying, now I can build a lightweight agent that now does this and keeps all of this in sync in real time and knows what's the most current, what's the most recent, and what's keeping things true. And so you're going to see the agentic framework and agentic agents kind of really start to scale as we move into the next 18 to 24 months. I think that's the horizon we're watching right now kind of grow. The other piece on the poisoning of the well, that's an important piece of it as well, as having the security frameworks in place. I mean, I read an article not long ago that was talking about it's kind of wild, where you look at someone was compromised, large entity or something, and someone got in, installed some ransomware or installed a bot farm and kind of took over and used this company to launch attacks on other things. I mean, now you're talking about if you have a compromise in a GPU ecosystem, like the level of attack that could be rendered on inside of your own company from that piece of infrastructure, it is light years. The speed of which that propagates and that attack happens is literally light years different than anything we've ever known. Whether that's an internal based attack on your own infrastructure from that point, or whether they use that point to do an external launch, an external attack. I mean, you're talking about, when we're talking about token generation and how many cycles and like the speed at which those things are happening right now. Imagine, an external attack or an internal attack happening at that rate of speed. Like that's hard for us to wrap our minds around, but that's another piece of why the security ecosystem becomes critically important. And then also the poisoning of the well, like when you're trusting that, hey, I'm getting this patient information, or I'm getting this, drilling information, or I'm getting this piece of information from my company, ensuring that, that data has not been poisoned, or there's not an unvalued or incorrect metric that's been dropped into that, because all the AI rendering is going to do is just retrain itself on the incorrect data. And so it's just a propagation point, from that day forward.
Yeah, and there are a couple of things there. I mean, we when we think about, especially cybersecurity, we always think about, the bad actors needing to bring tools with them. To your point, they can just make the tools on premises,
Yeah.
leveraging your own hardware. And the other thing that sort of ties in with that whole shadow IT conversation is, security also has to be able to identify, like, what is a shadow IT project that I didn't know about versus what is an actual bad actor that maybe is operating within my system. And so the more that we have these sort of ungoverned side projects that are going on, that aren't, controlled and understood and tracked and monitored, the easier it is for bad actors to kind of get lost within the system. And we're seeing at the same time dwell times of these bad actors, elongating, so that they can, extract more value, more money out of those victims. So yeah,
And
like
they
there's
get
a
they get very
much.
creative. I
Yeah.
think when you talk about ransomware, I think most everybody knows like what that is. Like, hey, I'm being held hostage. I'm either, being told, hey, I gotta pay up to get a crypto key to do a decrypt or something like that. But those are obvious. Like, so those are kind of in your face. The attack vectors that we're seeing today are shifting to silent bid error, silent data corruption, where they're injecting corruption into live data streams that it's not a ransomware signature. It's not a known detectable signature. So a lot of tools just kind of let that stuff go, but it's this rapid propagation of corrupt data into your database. And when it happens, you don't know it's happening. And until, you're like, I run a query for a particular set of data and it comes back around like, hey, what, like, why is this not correct? And then you start investigating and you realize, half your database is shot and you didn't even know it. And now you're in this massive recovery effort. We've we've announced some technology last year at Dell Tech World with what's called Dell Cyber Detect and it's built, capability with PowerStore where we can take snapshots, analyze those snapshots in a very near time for mission critical applications. So looking and this is all predicated on AI and ML. So recognizing that we have intelligence into SAP, we have intelligence into Oracle database, we have intelligence into SQL Server, we have intelligence into VMFS for VMware, right? And so we've got that level of understanding to know, yeah, we can detect a ransomware signature, that's a known signature, but these like, hey, if the workload starts shifting, and we start detecting things that are like, hey, that ain't normal, man. That's an anomaly. Being able to flag anomaly detection in ecosystems is becoming very critical.
And that's a good call out because we're seeing more and more that these, whether it's through APIs or whether it's through MCP services, we're seeing these AI tools be plugged into more and more of those structured data sets because that's where your data is that you want to generate insights out of. And I would be remiss if I didn't. I think I'm like contractually obligated to mention CDW Canada's cybersecurity study. So I just want to pause really quick. The security just came out, and we'll post a link in the video and in the podcast. It is not a product pitch; it is purely just information about the state of cybersecurity in Canada. So Evo would like to the call out. The team works really hard on that, so I will do that. And obviously security sort of ties into everything. So shifting a little bit because we've talked about a whole bunch of challenges. We've talked about the way that IT has had to change the way they operate. Getting more in line with the business, shadow IT. Let's talk a little more about how we can mitigate some of those challenges and those struggles. First is we talked about like the 240 kilowatt rack challenge and this concept and I think there are two things going on in the AI infrastructure world. There's two conversations that are happening here. The one conversation is really around hyperscalers and there's a whole bunch of
Yeah.
conversations happening there and when we look at enterprise and medium enterprise, especially in Canada, we look at our SMB space and our startups, and we're not seeing this gigafactory conversation. We're worried about, well, we've got physical restraints. We're trying to pack more into the same rack size. I'm having to elongate my racks, and now my cooling rows, the design there's needing to change. But when we look at these staggering sort of densities with GPUs being crammed in there, for the average enterprise, how do they start to mitigate some of those challenges?
Yeah, I think, it might sound a bit cliche, coming from an infrastructure guy, right? But modernization of infrastructure becomes a key part of the strategy. So, when CEW, of course, is, a very strategic partner to Dell Technologies and the resources that, you have to help do an analysis to come into a customer's environment and do an on-prem discovery and say, hey, you could optimize ecosystems, you could optimize the infrastructure, by doing basically by upgrading, by doing things that get you to a better position. And I'll give you, this is a real world example. I met with a Department of Defense entity. They were planning for their next gen data center build, which was in the process of happening. And they said, hey, historically we've run 20 25 kilowatts per rack. We're actually planning for our next gen. We figure a factor of 3 will be safe, so 60 to 65. And we just kind of laughed and said, no, like, if you're not planning, like if you're building out something and you're not planning, for north of 100 kilowatts per rack, like you're putting yourself in a deficit, right, by doing that. So you've really got to start planning for this, north of 130 kilowatts per rack. Well, then the question becomes like, where is that power going to come from, right? That
Mhm.
consolidation effort, like a lot of companies, they're like, I physically don't have that type of power coming into my building, right? So what do you do? Well, that's where the consolidation play starts to come in when you factor in, server technology, like with Dell. If you're running older server technology going up to modern 17, 18G technology, I mean, you're talking about a 7-to-1 consolidation ratio, right? So if I can take, 7 physical servers, collapse that down to one, and then give myself within that new rack room to do other things. When you factor in storage technologies like PowerStore, delivering, insane levels of data reduction and reducibility, but with the performance and scalability metrics, and that can be very small form factor. So I think, taking whether it's the compute infrastructure, the storage infrastructure, modernizing those things to get the best value, the best bang that you can in the smallest footprint package available, that's going to drive that rack density that allows customers to free up other rack, and they just sometimes they just don't tend to look at it that way. They just tend to look at it and say, well, I've got a row, I just need new servers, I'm just going to take that old server out and put that new server in. But they're not looking at that consolidation factor, and therefore freeing up power, right, in the data center to do these next generation capabilities.
Yeah, and I think a lot of what's driving some of that demand is maybe how we're also managing the way that we're going to work with this data. So another thing we were talking about a little bit was model sprawl, and really not having a model strategy, and so where a single AI project can all of a sudden turn into dozens of models. Or we don't I think NVIDIA and Jensen like to talk about having like a model evaluation flywheel. So you're identifying the right model, for that specific application or that specific workflow to help, optimize it. And we're also seeing like sometimes people are just deploying like the biggest model, thinking it's going to be better. But you have to think about, well, what is my consumption, and to your point about consolidation, if I can use a smaller model that uses less footprint, it needs, it's going to deliver the same value in fewer tokens. There's a lot of value in that. But you know you talk a little bit about model sprawl, and maybe some of the ways that organizations are looking at that and having success, mitigating some of those challenges.
Yeah, no, I think you pretty much hit it on the head. A lot of customers, I think there's this perception that if you're going to use AI, then it has to be big, right? It's got to be whatever the biggest thing is. I need the biggest infrastructure, the fastest infrastructure. Like I just everything's got to be big. That's not true. And I've seen more conversations in recent months, not LLM but SLM, right? And going into these small, models as opposed to large models. So it's the it, I mean it's the toolkit analogy. It's the right tool to do the right job. I was working with my neighbor. He does some wood crafting, and we were building a wine rack that my wife and I needed. And we were sitting over there, and we were trying to get this one piece of wood carved out right. And he had like, I'm over here like with a chisel and a hammer trying to make it work. And he's like, hey man, I got a router bit that like just does that, right? And so we popped it on, and bam, like within 30 seconds it was done. And it's like, it's good to have the right tool for the right job, right? And you can kind of knock it out rather quickly. And it's the same concept here. I think, customers are figuring out that just saying, hey, we need to use AI doesn't mean it has to be some big, explosive, massively expensive, large scale, high power consumption environment. Um, we're seeing more and more small level development, but the figuring out what you need, I think leveraging, expertise, a CDW of the world that says we've got expertise around, AI frameworks and automation frameworks. I think there's going to be more value in the consulting services and the ability to say, you know what, let's let's bring an expert to the table. Let's do a workshop. Let's do an evaluation and see what's the best use case for us, as opposed to me spending 18 months, trying to figure it out. When somebody's already figured it out and can help me look at, evaluate, and rapidly implement something that might be small, that's going to move the needle significantly for me and my business.
Yeah, and we're having a lot of motions around workshops and doing that, and you're right. Like there's things that you have to learn by experiencing, and then there's things that you can learn through others. And I do think that a lot of these foundational, learnings with AI can be learned through others' experiences. So yeah, absolutely. We had an interesting podcast. This would have been last year, early in the year, or maybe even longer, with a company called Web AI, and they had a very similar message around, bigger is not always better. You really want to tune it for like what you need, which is really good. The other challenge, when you look at actually doing the investment, because one of the things we talk about with customers is, you may not have an AI project on the books in the next 6 months, but you do maybe have a compelling event around needing to replace your storage, replace your network, replace your computing, and so making decisions as if AI is in the mix becomes, I think, really important for organizations, so that when you have those compelling events, you're making a incremental investment to empower AI, as opposed to, 6 months later when that AI project lands on your desk and you realize that your infrastructure or your environment isn't ready to handle that. And now you've got a multi-million dollar AI project because you had to rebuy a bunch of storage, et cetera. When organizations, especially with sort of the current state of things, they're having trouble getting budget for that capex. How when you talk to companies and business leaders, how are you helping them justify investment in platforms like PowerStore, that can scale and support those AI projects as they grow?
Yeah, you just said it, dude. Like scale. Like
Hmm.
you like if you're not investing, if you're not pushing your chips into an infrastructure, a storage infrastructure that can scale, right? you're you're hamstringing yourself like that. You're going to run into challenges and you're going to run into sprawl where it's like, oh, I got to buy another one, I got to buy another one, I got to buy another one, I got to buy and then all of a sudden you're running into management complexity, you're running into data placement complexity. Where do I put this workload? I got 20 different arrays. Do I put it here? 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 Right, trying to figure that out manually. So with power store and being able to scale up and scale out, so we can grow. And in fact, right now in the industry, NAND flash, I mean, it's money, right? I mean, it's big, and there are reasons, behind that, driven by AI data centers, by the way, consuming, the NAND flash that's available on the market. But in that context, when you say like, PowerStore can deliver, like you can start with as few as 6 drives. You can pop this thing in, and then as you need to grow, add one drive at a time. One. Like when you talk about the cost effective nature of, you don't have to come at this thing and throw something new at it or a massive disk packs, one drive at a time if that's all you want to do. Or if you do need another one, I can drop that into the cluster and now I have this scale out design. So yeah, I do a lot of preaching around PowerStore because it's kind of my baby. But I'm also the evangelist for primary storage, which means I cover PowerMax, PowerFlex, PowerScale, and all of those products that we have. Everything in our enterprise storage portfolio is scalable. And so that when you said, you know, what, how do we address the scalability issue? I mean, foundationally, it's ensuring that you're making an investment in a technology and a company that is scalable by definition, right? And being able to meet those expectations.
Yeah, and that's important too, especially as those expectations grow. So pivoting a bit to the future and I think you touched on some of these things, but I'd like to, sort of put the, let's put the ribbon on the, on the package, or put the, the icing on the cake. Um, as we look into the future, how does focusing on automation, how does looking at those multi-cloud strategies, how do organizations and IT professionals look at that next generation of IT, where they're supporting these AI workloads, they're supporting these real-time data platforms? Um, how does managed platforms play into that, and how does moving into more of a platform approach to your hybrid infrastructure, help organizations scale?
Yeah, right data in the right place at the right time, comes to mind, but also ensuring that you have a framework or a manageability landscape that can enable that type of technology. And last year at Dell Tech World, May of this year, we'll hit Dell Tech World 2026. But last year we announced Dell Automation Platform, which is targeted at that, is making the decision and the deployment methodology is simple as a customer needs to navigate these waters of, whether it's AI infrastructure. We have automation platform deployments for AI factories. We have Dell Private Cloud that's part of automation platform, which is multi-hypervisor and being able to shift hypervisors or run multiple hypervisors simultaneously on the same infrastructure and repurposing that at the click of a button. We mentioned, early in the conversation talking about this, focus on containers. I mean, imagine like an OpenShift deployment where you say, hey, I've got to take a handful of servers, I've got to install Red Hat, I got to install OpenShift, I got to connect that to my storage array, I got to go to the storage array, I got to create hundreds of volumes, I've got to do CSI mapping and integration, I got to like that is a multi-day, multi-week process, depending on how big or how scalable that is. What if that happened in less than 2 hours at the click of a button from
Mhm.
bare metal to run? Like that's what we've delivered. That's what we've brought to the table. So, being able to say I can run, multiple hypervisors, I can optimize your Broadcom environment, I can simplify your OpenShift, journey and getting to, the full Kubernetes and automation landscape. You can make that shift into Nutanix if you want to do that. You can deploy Azure local, and which is a growing concept in the framework as well. So being able to do all of these different things from one place, but giving you that cloud operating simplicity where I can click, click, go, or externally I can build hooks in, via API development, into that, building agentic agents and frameworks and MCP. They can say, hey, for my AI factory, I want to be able to call this, but the vector database is going to live, on this PowerStore box sitting over here. And I need all this to collaborate, work together, and connect together. And you could do all of that in a simplified ecosystem. So, what we're doing, with infrastructure from Dell Technologies and then delivering the lifecycle management, the governance, the security, the compliance. I mean, even in Dell Automation Platform and Dell Private Cloud, when you click deploy, that is also ensuring that your corporate governance and security, standards are met as part of that deployment. So it's not just, IT administrators going, well, I installed the server, I installed this patch, what if they miss something, right? This ensures that repeatable process gets delivered every single time in the same way, regardless of what you're deploying. So it's those things all coming together, I think is what's going to move the needle for customers as we move forward.
Yeah, and we've been talking about that concept for a while. I do think automation helps, but the concept around like shifting left in the development cycle, and there was a big push. I think I know I talked to a lot of customers probably 5, 6, 7 years ago. Was like, look, like take all of your security demands, your cybersecurity, your governance, and try to push that earlier in your application development project deployment scheduling so that you don't get to the end and it's like, well, yeah, the only thing we have left to do is do a big, data governance and process governance and get all of our governance check off. That's the last thing we need to do. And it's like, no, no, no. You want to do that earlier in the process. You want to have your firewall rules configured, your networking security, your encryption, all done as part of the project so that when you get to the end of the line, you don't have a second project where you have to now backtrack and do all of that. So I think that's really important um, now to put that lens against the operational side of things. Like, how do we shift these operational activities earlier into the process as well? And I think you're right. I think having a platform that can take on a lot of that complexity and give you more of those controls makes it easier. I also think there's a big need for self-service. So how does that cloud operating model and your developers wanting self-service, how do those kind of collide and how can platforms maybe help with some of that?
Yeah. So just to touch on the close off that thought on the security framework, I mean,
Mhm.
zero trust is everything.
Yeah.
We've historically lived in a, hey, I've got all this infrastructure, I've deployed it, now let me make it secure, right? We have to shift to it's secure. Now all I got to do is deploy it, right? I mean, so that is that zero trust development framework, that that Dell is maniacal about. Everything we do is predicated on zero trust development methodologies. Moving into the self service capabilities and taking developers and saying that we have a lot of customers, for example, that even though we have award winning ease of use graphical interfaces for PowerStore, they're never they don't even know what it looks like. They're never they're never going to log in yet. They're never going to log into that interface. They've built their own self-service portal for their company. You've got a user, a developer that says, I need a virtual machine, I need this database, I need this, and then click, they order in their own little tool, boom, 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 and everything is API self-service on the back end, connected. And in some cases, that might also mean integration to things like ServiceNow, kicking off workflow automation, et cetera. That is standard, right, and mandatory. And so, one of the interesting things about PowerStore when we brought it to market was the thought process for external programmability was the standard. So
Hmm.
whatever we can do in the GUI, we can do in REST. Whatever we do in REST, we can do in the GUI. So you have that predicate of whatever it is that you want to do, it is externally programmable. There are also plugin frameworks, available, right, to be able to do these things, automate those things. For example, we were talking about the Dell Private Cloud. We actually have a demo out there. It's available on YouTube, but it shows a Red Hat deployment, an OpenShift deployment, where part like just by clicking go, saying I want those three servers, and there's my PowerStore array. Deploy Red Hat, go.
Hmm.
It goes, format, basically blasts those servers, installs Red Hat bare metal. As that's going, it's talking to the storage and saying, I'm going to need, these, 200 volumes, create those volumes. And oh, by the way, Red Hat's done installing. I'm going to install the CSI plugin, the CSM framework from Dell Technologies. I'm going to download that. I'm going to do validations. I'm going to make sure that it's up to the latest security patches. It's up to the latest code version. Everything is on par. Oh, wait a minute. You've got this version of this. I need this pack. Boom. I'm going to grab that. I'm going to deploy that. And then pam, 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 pam. And it does all of these checks to make sure that everything is where it needs to be from a standards perspective. And then, all you did was go to lunch, right? And you come back and this is done, but you've met, all of your security requirements, governance requirements, the infrastructure is deployed, and that could have completely been built into a self-service model where you don't even touch this. You could have your own self-service provisioning portal, that's just making API calls into this. So fully open programmable APIs, whether it's our automation platform, whether it's our infrastructure, that is a key piece of the evaluation.
Yeah, and I think I'm gonna yeah, this is gonna create a point in time where we're having this conversation, and I try not to do that too much, but I think it's important. From a cybersecurity side, we talk a little bit about Q day. What the day where quantum computing is more mass available, or and the struggles that's going to cause with sort of legacy encryption, and if no if none of your current encryption is good enough, and somebody is able to then decrypt that in real time with quantum computing, like what challenges does that provide? I'm going to coin a term that I haven't heard yet, but I'm going to call it M Day. And M Day is the day that Anthropic's Mythos model goes live, or a competitive product that can do what it does as far as its understanding of code, its ability to fix coding issues, but also potentially exploit issues that have been dormant within these major code stacks for 15, 20 years. So I think you bring up a really important point, and that is organizations today need to have the ability to do all of this patching across all of these disparate systems and do the governance and the attestation for that, because we're very quickly approaching a period of time where the coding abilities of these AI models that they're going to impart upon us, could be very easily used, by bad actors. So I think it's really important, again, as we're looking at these platforms, how can we, expedite the remediation of those flaws in as close to real time as possible, knowing that organizations, like Dell, like all these other major partners that we deal with, are going to be potentially reviewing all of their code and putting out a whole slew of updates over the next 3 to 6 months, with I'm gonna say M Day kind of in in their minds.
Yeah, post quantum, you're going to hear at Dell Tech World. You're going to hear a lot about that. In fact, I'll be doing two sessions on what's new with PowerStore. We're going to have some incredible announcements. But you're going to see the frameworks for post quantum mentioned quite a lot, and being very security conscious. Or to your point, I mean, you've got attackers that may have grabbed data today that's sitting on a shelf somewhere that's encrypted. It's AES 256. They don't have the ability to unlock that or decrypt it. But in a PQC world, if they can get access to a post quantum farm, and within a matter of minutes to hours, bam, like that 30 terabytes of data they stole that was completely unusable, they now have access to everything, right? So those are real scenarios. Dell actually sits uh, maybe sitting on the board is not the exact right term, but we are at the table, for decision making around post quantum standards and capabilities within protocol integration and crypto integration. So a lot of that, we're helping shape and craft the industry on, which is a critical part of the conversation. But I think to your point too, the expedition or expediting the nature of which customers adopt code versions or security fixes. Like we still live in a world where a lot of customers are saying, well, we only do code upgrades, once a year or every 6 months or something. Like that is that is going to change. That is going to change, right? Because you can't run, that long with the rate and the pace of which the technology is changing. And again, I think therefore you need to adopt into ecosystems and infrastructure that can simplify the upgrade process, ensure that those environments are scalable, and ensure that they're meeting and exceeding the security standards and requirements, for your business.
Yeah, I think that's a exactly, and I think it's just more of those requirements, and IT's gonna have to figure it out. So
Yes.
we'll leave on a bit of a high note. What is the future of storage, and it's nice because there's so many of these areas within IT that I think have not, I'm going to say sexy, have not been sexy for a while. All of a sudden, storage. Is sexy. It's required. There's a more focus on it. I think we're seeing a lot more innovation over the last couple of years that I think have prepared us very well. But what is the future state of storage, and it's how it's going to drive value for the business look like, and then what does excite you the most about the future of storage and leveraging tools like AI?
Yeah, I think the agentic frameworks I mentioned earlier, being able to build, literal agents into the operating environments of the storage ecosystem, that number one, simplifies decision making, automates the provisioning process, automates the what used to be manual, someone sitting there clicking something, someone typing a command, all of that becoming completely automated. So rapidly simplifying the ecosystem and the manageability of the infrastructure. And on top of that, the autonomous decision making capabilities of optimization, of saying, hey, if it's sitting here 1 minute and it's better optimized if it's sitting here the next minute, or maybe it's not a physical move of the data, maybe it's the flip of a path, and from the host to the storage, or on the back end of the storage array, for example. So we've put a lot of effort into technologies that we call DNA, dynamic node affinity, which allows us to autonomously look at the data. This is happening today. So real time data coming into the array and saying, hey, I can guarantee that you're going to get better performance, better efficiency, better lower latency if I flip this backend path and it has no impact to the host at all. Boom, done. Right? Storage making decisions on your behalf so that you're not having to sit there, plan, calculate, make decisions, take outage windows, open, change requests, to where, oh, I'm going to go manually touch something. No, the system is self-optimizing. It's doing it itself. So I think, we're just kind of on the horizon of seeing the capabilities of those autonomous frameworks within the context of the storage operating environments. And I think Dell's really leading the way there.
Yeah, and I great insights. I love it. I think one of the interesting things about the conversation and sort of having our pre-discussion before we did the recording today is we touched on a lot of things that aren't necessarily what I would say 15 years ago when I, as a storage admin, I would have been focused on. And we talked about the business, we talked about self-service, we talked about the need for, mobility. We talked about tying into, ITSM platforms. We talked, like being able to really incorporate your structured data and SaaS services. And so I think it really just goes to show the importance of data and the importance of where it sort of falls within the hierarchy of IT and services and applications and delivering value. So I really want to thank you, Jody. I think your insights are great. If anybody goes to Dell Tech World, I think I think I'm going to be there. But if I am, I'll definitely take a look at your presentations, because I would love to get those insights. And I'm also kind of visual, so I like seeing some of the visuals you guys put together, and that helps me better understand all that. But really appreciate you jumping on the podcast today, and it's always great to get insights and that. But anyways, like I said, just thanks for coming out, thanks for talking about this, thanks for making this as interesting, and really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think it's that dynamic of what you just said, 10, 15 years ago, we would have been talking about, floggy and fabric design and short stroking drives. And yeah, but now the conversation has shifted dynamically to automation frameworks and capabilities. And so the storage admin of today is a very different dynamic. And it's just a really, to your point, storage is cool again, right? It's a really cool place to be.
Yeah, and thanks to listeners for joining us. Really appreciate it. That's been Jodey Hogeland with Dell. Really appreciate the insights, Jody, and looking forward to learning more in the future. For those of you, really when you look at sort of tech tips of the week, I think it's going to be around, with storage. Look at automation. Look at platforms. Look at the ways that you can manage a lot of the complexity we talked about today, by leveraging those platforms and those centralized management consoles. And then, ask your AI assistants, have them sort of build out a plan, let them know kind of where you're at with your journey into automation and your journey of leveraging storage to drive value for your organization, and have it help build an adoption plan. They're great for that. But thanks again. It's been the CDW Tech Talks podcast, and we'll catch you next time.